Well, hello there. I was wondering around last week about my thoughts on the year 2025. Initially, I had perceived 2025 to be an year of tumult and shock and surprise. However, given that we are about 6 months now into 2026 and it has already surpassed practically everything that happened in 2025, my surprise seems mellow in hindsight. This month, especially May, has been a roller coaster, especially in India. We had the national entrance cum eligibility test, that is NEET, the exam for the doctors going into undergraduate, getting leaked, which, although that wasn't exactly very surprising, was still shocking to the point that despite what happened in 2024, something on this scale could happen again. Then we had the Cockroach Janata Party, whose exact agenda I still cannot wrap my head around, especially the amount of followers they have on Instagram and what their exact agenda is related to Indian politics. Among all of this, we also had a slight diplomatic incident, so to speak. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was on his 5-country trip, which started in the United Arab Emirates, then went to the Netherlands, then Sweden, then Norway for the 3rd Indo-Nordic Summit, ending with Italy, where we had a few more memes regarding the Melody Toffees gifts to the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. The specific incident I talk about in Norway, which happened on the 18th of May in Oslo City Hall, was about what was a media interaction per se between the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Norwegian Prime Minister. After their remarks on the strategic discussions between the two diplomatic parties, both of them made their way outward. However, in the middle of that, a Norwegian journalist, namely Helle Lang, of the Norwegian newspaper Dagsavisen, which translates to the daily newspaper in Norwegian, which was initially the workers' newspaper some decades back and then rebranded, shouted out loud in the middle of the hallway, Prime Minister Modi, won't you take questions from the freest press in the world? That single statement has completely overshadowed not only the discussions between India and Norway, but the entire prime ministerial tour of those 5 countries. Now, there's been a lot of misinformation floating around on social media platforms. Politics has done what politics has done, politicizing the issue into something which has been blown out of proportion from what it originally should have perceived to have been. So I felt that it was perhaps my responsibility to inform the people about what actually happened there and what we should take from it. Now, it is very clear that the journalist's question was not exactly intended to induce a questions forum right in that incident in an amicable manner. It was clearly meant to attract media attention, which it has very obviously succeeded profoundly in. However, what was even more startling for me personally was the press interaction between the Indian diplomatic delegation headed by the Secretary of the External Affairs Ministry, West, Sibi George, headed by Sibi George, where this very journalist posed 2 major questions, which she also then sent updates about on her social media accounts. First was the fact that, in general terms, in terms of tradition, when visiting Oslo, heads of states or heads of governments of other countries generally allow a press interaction with the Norwegian press and allow questions to be asked and answer them. This was not the case this time. To clear the air, it was not that the Norwegian press had not been informed that there would be no questions. It was officially a media interaction. However, the fact that this visit was blowing away many decades of tradition was what was probably the Norwegian press's questioning about. Another thing was India's Press Freedom Index rankings. Now, this was something which had not come out of the blue suddenly from this journalist's mouth. Even the Norwegian government, before the delegation came to Norway from India, had raised concerns about some incidents of press freedom in India and how they intended to discuss it with the Indian Prime Minister and his delegation. The fact of the matter is, the point about India's Press Freedom Index is not completely unbased. We have seen in the past decades of many incidents of journalists getting shot down, of the dominance of few news networks across the entire country, and the fact that polarization has also increased due to the fact that many news agencies have turned this into a dichotomy of views, with one side supporting leftist views or certain parties and the other side supporting quite contrasting views. What we have not seen in many years at least is the fact that a newspaper setup coming around which neutrally criticizes and appreciates the initiatives of many different segments of India's governance, of India's politics, of India's economic growth, of India's economic mishaps, of our security failures and our security successes, and so on. In that context, when a foreign journalist proclaims that India's press freedom index ranking is about 157th, 158th in the world, having fallen from 133rd, which was, to be fair, already not a very good ranking since 2016, is something that we shouldn't rebuff as simply foreign propaganda, but something that we should recognize to some extent. Sibi George, on his part, appeared a bit agitated by the interruptions and let out a narrative of what is generally followed by Indian diplomats when asked about such questions, about India's democratic noise, so to speak, which speaks on its behalf about India's freedom, about India's journalistic press rights, about the freedom of speech in India, and how many different parties and segments of the populace can raise their voices when it comes to different issues. That was a clever circumvention of what might have turned into an even greater media disaster. However, the fact of the matter is that it was, in fact, a circumvention. What we have still not managed to answer is why was the press interaction cancelled? Now, of course, I cannot speak on behalf of the Indian delegation. There might have been time constraints that had been communicated to the Norwegian government due to the fact that the Prime Minister was on a long tour across many different countries, having come from Asia, the UAE, and traveling across a large part of Europe. However, clear indications, clear clarification was not given either. Even worse was the fact that the politicization of this issue turned from what is generally considered a sharp interaction vis-a-vis government and press into something that was considered debasatory of the Indian establishment, which was considered an insult on the part of the journalist. Now, India, of course, isn't very used to journalists openly asking the Indian Prime Minister such questions. And again, as I said, the tone in which that question was asked wasn't exactly very promissory in terms of peacefulness or amicability. So finally, what we should conclude in this month of tumult as it comes to an end, with the world not looking very peaceful in the coming years at any rate, is the fact that India, while it's growing in many ways, also has to introspect into its own actions, into its own misgivings, into its own failures, instead of trying to rebuff every single thing that is said about it. Now, it is also very true that many Western indexes about press freedom, about human rights, the happiness indexes, are often biased in a way to Western countries and their allies against countries like India in many ways. But we cannot treat that as an excuse for much longer. And finally, when we speak about India, about how it has managed to achieve this growth, despite its many hurdles, we must remember a line, that at some point, the cat playing the piano shall not be praised only because it is a cat. At some point, people will ask how well it plays the piano.